Okay, great. Let's get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ariana and I head up the product marketing team here at Foursquare, which focuses on our marketers products, which includes our ad targeting and attribution solutions. Today, you'll be hearing from Tyler Finn on how marketers like you can navigate the shifting identity landscape. Tyler Finn is our Director of Data Strategy here at Foursquare, where he helps guide policy and regulatory, product, and corporate strategy. He joined Foursquare via our merger with Factual, where he led global privacy compliance. And Tyler actually started his career working on commercial drone policy and regulatory issues. He also serves on the International Association of Privacy Professionals Education Advisory Board and is also an advisor to TechGC, which is a leading community for technology sector general counsels. So welcome, Tyler, and I'll let you take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Ariana, and thanks for all your help in organizing this event today. And I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the shifting identity landscape, shifting privacy landscape, and how Foursquare is working to future-proof our product offerings and help you navigate these changes as well. Why don't we go to the agenda slide? And can you move forward one, Ariana?
Are you able to see the agenda?
There we go. Now we can.
Okay. Sorry
I knew it
about
off the top of my head too, but for those on the line. So first today, we're going to take a look at the timeline of major privacy and identity changes that have led us to this particular moment in time and the landscape that we're operating in today. Then we're going to go and discuss challenges that marketers like you are currently facing and lay out some actionable steps, 3 actionable steps that you can start taking to prepare for what the world is going to look like in a couple years' time. And then at the end, Ariana will come back. We'll finish off the time with a live question and answer session. So feel free to submit any questions you might have in the chat throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible at the end. Why don't we move forward one? Just a brief sort of overview of Foursquare in case you're less familiar with us. I really think of our business as creating a bridge between the digital and physical world, right? We aim to be the leading independent location platform working with the world's largest brands to help deliver business outcomes, including reaching consumers based on real-world behavior, measuring campaign effectiveness via offline visitation, helping you develop and create a sort of whole-scale marketing plan with accuracy, accessibility, scale, and especially from where I sit, right, respect for consumer data privacy. We want to be the location technology platform that the marketing world and the broader enterprise world trusts. Why don't we go to the next slide? I think of this as being our thesis, right? You know, what drove you to the webinar today? Probably a sort of curiosity or a need for clarity around a rapidly changing advertising industry. And as it's now evident, right, the evolution of our space around data privacy, user identity, and the broader business models that underlie digital content delivery and digital services is underway. This is an evolution in my mind that has been building for the better part of a decade, and it's because of a need to prioritize consumer privacy. And so even though it feels like this is happening sometimes quickly or suddenly, we've really seen this landscape for a number of years that's changing incrementally, and we've been preparing our business, and we feel like this is a moment in time where we and where marketers more broadly really need to lean in, because the future is going to look different. Consumer privacy will be prioritized, And this is the moment in time to invest in both knowledge and also sort of product evolution and strategy evolution to meet the market where it's going to be in a couple of years. Before we talk about some of those strategies, why don't we talk about how we got here? If we go to the next slide. And taking a look backwards, you can see the sort of set of iterative changes, right? There are changes that have been made by policymakers, right? The GDPR going into effect in Europe was certainly a watershed moment in the privacy landscape. The California Consumer Privacy Act brought privacy legislation, comprehensive privacy legislation, to the shores of the United States. The press has played a big role in shaping a dialogue around consumer privacy and making consumers more aware of how their data is being collected and used. And we also see platforms acting like policymakers in a lot of ways, whether it's via intelligent tracking prevention in Safari, ultimately third-party cookie deprecation in Google Chrome, and a new privacy sandbox initiative, as well as new, say, like location services permissions on both iOS and then on Android, in app tracking transparency framework that launched on iOS this year. So, you know, across the board, right, press, policymakers, and platforms all acting to shape a public perception around privacy, and ultimately consumers, right, beginning to consider and take a more vested interest in controlling their own privacy online in apps as they navigate the digital world. I want to level set on sort of what Apple's changes have meant for our business, as well as what Google's future changes will mean. So why don't we go to the next slide and talk about the app tracking transparency framework. This was something that was announced last year, ultimately rolled out in the spring of this year with iOS 14.5. And there's both a sort of technical component to the ATT framework and consent, as well as a policy component. The technical component is that if you are an app developer and you'd like to access the identifier for advertisers, or Apple's version of a mobile advertising ID, you have to surface this ATT consent. Until that happens, the IDFA is zeroed out. And then there's also a policy component as well. Apple lists out in guidance online a variety of other data uses that they believe constitute what they call tracking. They have a somewhat broad definition of tracking. And I think probably most important for this audience is that if there's data, user data, device level data that's being collected by an app developer and then linked with user or device level data from other third-party apps or from third-party websites, you also need to be surfacing this consent. And so this is something that we as Foursquare are doing in our owned and operated apps in City Guide and Swarm and Rewards. It's something that our SDK partners are doing. They're providing data to Foursquare. It's something that data suppliers are doing. And we have continued to see healthy scale, right, across both sort of our first party and also our third party data assets or panels. But we've also seen a couple of other sort of interesting trends, right, which is, you know, more competitive bidding for iOS inventory. Some programmatic advertisers are shifting spend from iOS to Android because of inventory constraints. So, you know, while our panel size and while our sort of scale remains very strong today, certainly sort of a wider implication for the advertising ecosystem from these changes, not to mention the sort of consumer awareness and consumer control that this has brought, which is certainly a good thing. Why don't we go to the next slide and talk about what Google is planning to do. Google is running an initiative that they're calling Privacy Sandbox, which will ultimately determine what the next steps for advertising in Chrome will look like when they decide to begin blocking third-party cookies. And the timeline that they have now outlined is that third-party cookies will be blocked and the replacement for them will be rolled out by the end of 2023. This was supposed to potentially happen next year after a series of sort of competition inquiries by competition regulators in places like the UK. They've delayed that again. I think that there is certainly sort of plenty of time for our industry to prepare for and explore what solutions will look like in a landscape without third-party cookies. And the other thing to say here is that, you know, the most likely solutions that Google adopts as a part of Privacy Sandbox are delivery of ads based on cohorts. As consumers browse the web, the browser itself will place users into cohorts, and advertisers will be able to buy or bid against those cohorts. What exactly measurement looks like in that landscape is a little bit uncertain. We'll discuss that later on as well. But I think the sort of key takeaways here, third-party cookies are definitely going away, right? They've already been blocked in Mozilla, they've already been blocked in Apple for a number of years, but there is plenty of time to prepare for these sorts of changes. Why don't we go to the next slide. I think really the changes that have been made by platforms, the sort of broader privacy landscape, leaves marketers at a crossroads. And so, you know, well, we still continue to say have healthy mobile ad ID scale. We are thinking long term. And I view the sort of future, we as Foursquare view the future as involving sort of three main channels. One of our product managers and even the IAB describes this sort of approach or this sort of view of the landscape as a portfolio approach, or this is a portfolio of solutions that will exist in the future. The first is the walled gardens that we've been familiar with. I would almost put cohort-based ad delivery, those flock and fledge proposals under Privacy Sandbox in there. It's not quite a walled garden, but they're being rolled out by Google, so we can add them in there. Marketers should certainly have a strategy around walled gardens. I think that there's been an increased focus on contextual, and we offer proximity, a solution that I'll tell you more about today. And you know, contextual targeting is certainly great from a consumer privacy perspective, should be a component of the strategy that you're rolling out, but it's not the answer to everything, right? I think ultimately a full retrenchment to contextual targeting would be really a wealth transfer from smaller publishers and small and medium-sized businesses back to sort of major conglomerates or very large sort of blue chip publishers. So contextual is one strategy, something that I think you should be leaning into, but not the answer to everything, either from a marketing perspective or from sort of what we want the economy that is the internet to look like. And then third-party addressable, and this is going to change. This is not going to be reliant on cookies. It's not going to be as reliant on mobile ad IDs. Instead, you're going to see a real move towards authenticated relationships. And we'll talk about some of the solutions like Unified ID that you see there today as well. Why don't we go to the next slide? Yeah. So as marketers, right, what are the steps that you should be taking to prepare today for this future? I'm going to try to walk you through some actionable tips, so that way you can walk away after the presentation and go back to your clients or go back to your strategy teams and begin implementing those today. Why don't we go to the next slide? So the first sort of tip here, I think, is around what you can be doing now, as opposed to sort of things to keep on your radar or things that are out in the future. And I think that here, right, we would urge you to consider new solutions, right, that are not as reliant upon sort of old methods of persistent identity, but involve authenticated relationships, as well as re-emerging solutions. Why don't we talk first about contextual and the sort of solution that Foursquare has around contextual. So, we think that real-time location is a contextual solution, just like the context of a user who's reading a golf article of a sports news site. The context of where a consumer is in the real world can help you as a marketer connect with them during a moment of receptivity. So like I like to think of, at a grocery store, right? They might be able to, or you might be able to influence a last minute purchase, or while they're socializing at a bar or a restaurant, especially now that people are going back out to bars and restaurants again. Right, our proximity solution does this, and it isn't reliant upon a persistent ID. And so, we have software that sits at a DSP, and when a lat long in a bid request matches with a lat long in a geofence, an ad is delivered. This is a sort of privacy sensitive solution that I think meets the market where it needs to be today, and offers a sort of contextual complement to the traditional sort of like audience or segment based targeting that a lot of you probably employ. So the sort of move back to contextual is something that we're focused on educating clients on today. If we go to the next slide, we also believe that the future, right, is going to involve more logged in experiences, more authenticated relationships with consumers. And so we are a big proponent of the Unified ID initiative. If you are not familiar with it yet, Unified ID is a new identifier that was developed by the Trade Desk, but now has been handed off to Prebid, to IAB Tech Lab, to the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, and is going to be it is an open source identity framework. And so really, right, it's aiming to maintain and then actually enhance the ways that marketers have been able to engage with consumers via third-party cookies in the past, or mobile ad IDs. And I think that the benefits here are really around consumer privacy, right? If it's based on an authenticated relationship with the consumer, they are opting into the sharing of this information, right? I think of it as almost being a public utility solution, right? Ultimately, I expect participants will begin to, pay into a sort of entity that's running this for the benefit of the sort of entire constellation of digital content providers or digital service providers that are leveraging Unified ID. It's maintaining addressability as third-party cookies go away. But because it's based upon a logged in or an authenticated relationship with the user, right? I think it's also going to be better for cross-channel advertising, especially in places like connected television, where the market is still poised for a lot of growth. So, the Trade Desk has been a long-term and valuable partner to us at Foursquare. We were the first location data company to integrate with Unified ID, something that we pushed hard to complete first from a product perspective. We already automatically include UIDs in all of our US-based audiences that are being delivered to the Trade Desk. We're hopeful, and we see other DSPs and other cloud partners too beginning to integrate with and adopt Unified IDs. Those UIDs are delivered right alongside maids and cookies for the time being. And so ultimately today, right, this really just offers you as a marketer the opportunity to reach more consumers across any identifier, across any screen, whether it's mobile, whether it's browser, whether it's CTV, et cetera. Why don't we go to the next slide? I want to talk briefly as well about some trends that we think that you should be keeping on your radar, right? Like we've talked about a couple of things that you can do today. What are things that we expect will play out even over the next year or so in 2022 that you should have on your radar? And I think we'll be talking first about sort of right how measurement is going to be reimagined, and then about the shift that a lot of marketers are making towards use of first-party data. Why don't we go to the next slide? So if we think about reimagining measurement, right, for a world in which authenticated relationships are much more important, potentially in which there isn't even access to identity in certain cases, in which there is less data sharing between different third parties or between controllers or those who are collecting the data, and between those who are service providers. We have a couple of solutions that we're excited about. So the first is hashed email based attribution. In the absence of a mobile ad ID or a cookie identifier, we are having partners already today begin to pass us ad exposures that include a hashed email instead of a MAID or instead of a cookie. I think that for the next couple of years, the sort of sharing of ad exposure data will almost involve three columns, right? One column is mobile ad IDs, one column is cookies, one column is hashed emails, right? In the future, more and more of that data may be coming in with hashed emails. And there's the possibility at some point in time of things like unified ID and other industry-driven identity solutions also being included in this. We're doing this today with some partners. We've seen success. It's an emerging option, but certainly something that I think you should keep on your radar as we head into 2022, and there are more and more logged in experiences across the web, in apps, etc. The other thing that we're really focused on is what happens when the advertiser or the publisher in question really doesn't want to share that exposure data with Foursquare for privacy reasons, because they're sort of concerned about broader data leakage within the advertising ecosystem. And so, we've partnered with a few of our attribution clients, with clean rooms, with cloud providers, to begin working on what I would describe as a sort of private join and compute solution around measurement or around attribution, where Foursquare is taking visitation data and the advertiser is taking exposure data and putting it into a clean room environment. Usually the identifiers for the match are hashed. There's differential privacy techniques that are also used as a part of the hash, or part of the match, I should say, between those two data sets to inject some noise in there and offer further privacy protection for the consumers whose data is being processed. I think that this is a great solution for clients and for partners who over the long run are going to become more sensitive around data sharing, even with service providers. Alongside this, I mentioned the possibility of measurement, even where identity isn't present. We see from a sort of a reach perspective, like reaching consumers, that there may be a shift towards cohorts. We talked about that in the context of Google and Privacy Sandbox. We are doing research today and thinking, not tomorrow, but over the longer run, how we may be able to offer cohort-based matching to perform attribution, measurement, other sort of in-house analytics for clients. So this is early days. I think that these are great solutions. I'm confident that we'll be able to measure and over the course of 2022. But I think that these are really moving measurement to a place where it's happening in a more private and more privacy conscious way that will align with not just where advertisers want to be or where developers want to be, but also, right, the expectation that consumers will have around the use of their data. Why don't we go to the next slide? So, brands and agencies may have access to their own customer data, right? I think that having a first-party data strategy is really important. And Foursquare has thought of our own first-party data is very important from a strategic perspective, very valuable from a strategic perspective for a long time. It's something that we've been investing in and that we want to continue to grow. We just relaunched one of our apps as Rewards by Foursquare a couple of months ago. We understand the importance of investing in these first-party apps, not just because of sort of the ability to collect check-ins through City Guide. Check-ins are what feed our visit detection methodology, but also because the value gained by users having a direct relationship with us, right, gives us a place to test and learn as platforms change, to understand how consumer sentiment is evolving. I think one of the questions that I get asked most frequently is, what do your opt-in rates look like? And not only do we see really high opt-in rates around location across our apps, but the sort of ATT consent that was rolled out that was so concerning to a lot in the advertising industry, we're seeing opt-in between about 10 and 40, 45% across O&O and partners who have integrated with our SDK. That is, right, significantly higher, I would say, than the sort of industry average of 5%. And ultimately, I think that comes down to value exchange, right? Consumers understanding, why is the data being collected? How is it going to be used? How is there functionality in the app around, say, location collection that benefits me as the consumer? And so, we have this sort of first-party data strategy ourselves. I think that for marketers, the collection of first-party data is only going to be more important. We're also thinking longer run about solutions for helping first parties understand their own location data that they're collecting outside of our SDK offering. I think that going back to your clients and talking about what their first-party data strategy is, how they might be able to activate that, is a conversation to begin having now. Why don't we go to the next slide? Questions. So, when you're considering sort of not only the long-term location partner for your brands, but also just partners generally who you're working with throughout the marketing ecosystem, what are the sort of questions that you should be asking with them? What's the type of conversation that you should be having with them to understand how they, will not only sort of survive over the long run, survive over the next couple of years, but really be viable and thrive. Why don't we go to the next slide? And we've got some examples here for you. So, the first one is how are you gathering your data? I filled out in a prior life doing privacy compliance for us, countless RFIs. Those are a good way to collect information around how data is being gathered. But I also think it's important to just have that conversation with the client, right? Are you considering, who the data is being sourced from? What's the long-term viability of those sources? How are you maintaining scale? What do you think about consumer consent? And is that really at the forefront of your strategy around data collection? How are you gathering your data? I think is a key question to ask providers across a range of sort of data providers. What are you doing to future-proof your business, right? We've talked today a little bit about some of the product work that we've done both already over the course of the past year or two, as well as plans that we have going forward. And I think that, preparing for this future does not happen overnight. And so you want to be in business and working with a partner who's already begun this work, who, right, is really thinking about this as they develop their product roadmap. So that way solutions are already in place and are already tested when, say, third-party cookie deprecation begins to have a material impact on your marketing strategy. Another question, right, how are you ensuring, and I already alluded to this, that your business will not only survive but thrive in 2+ years? I think that you want partners who are thinking long-term. This is not a sort of short-term play. The move to prioritizing consumer privacy is going to be something that is going to be with us for the next decade. So you want people who are thinking, you want partners who are thinking about how they're preparing for this future, how they're innovating, and how their business model ultimately is well positioned to thrive in this new world. I also think it's important that you end up working with folks who are working with others in industry. So asking your partner if they're co-innovating with other emerging leaders on identity solutions, whether that's Unified ID, whether that's LiveRamp, whether that's other ID solutions that are out in market, right? You want to be working with someone who has great relationships across the ecosystem. Ask them if they're participating in industry working groups on these issues, what their long-term partnerships look like. I'm a big believer that in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty, access to better or more perfect information than others have becomes ever more important. And so you want to be working with partners that are really out there in the market and engaging with the rest of the market as they develop their own product strategies. And then I think that the final thing here is really, do your partners have a clear, or asking your partner, do you have a clear understanding of exactly how the implications of whether it's privacy law changes or platform level changes map to your business, right? The first thing that you need to do as a data provider or as anybody operating in the advertising ecosystem, it's changing so much right now, is think about exactly how, right, the changes that are occurring map to your existing set of products, and then begin to develop the strategy. And so going and trying to get a sense of whether or not your partners have done that homework of mapping what's happening in the ecosystem, whether it's third-party cookie deprecation or whether it's the ATT consent or whether it's controller processor relationships under GDPR, right, or an opt-out of sale under CCPA, whether or not they've mapped that to their product offerings and then are developing a strategy on top of those changes. Why don't we go to the next slide? I guess I would just sort of conclude before we get to Q&A and sort of recap what we've talked about today by saying, we've been thinking about this for a long time, and I see quite a bit of alignment between the sort of Foursquare everywhere mission that we have, which means making our data available everywhere that you want to buy media or want to measure, right? And the way that we are now approaching an evolving identity landscape where we support growing number of diverse identifiers that are out there, things like hashed emails, like unified IDs, the fact that we have a flexible identity graph that's able to accommodate multiple forms of persistent identity, is really, being an independent player and being a player that's meeting the market where it's going to be. And so from this sort of vantage point, as a piece in the ad tech ecosystem, as a piece in the sort of enterprise ecosystem, right, we continue to be in constant contact with different partners, getting feedback on how they're handling these changes, iterating on our own strategy. We want to make sure that we're in lockstep with all of the other major players out there, and ultimately are going to meet the market where it's going to be in the next couple of years. Why don't we recap quickly what we've talked about? First, today we chatted about strategies that you should be implementing, right? Things like geocontextual targeting, like Unified ID 2.0. Then we talked about trends to keep on your radar, right? Having a first-party data strategy, I think, is something that is critical for brands, for marketers, for app developers, right? Thinking about how measurement may change in the future and ways to measure in a private way is something that I think all brands or all marketers should be thinking about and considering. And then some questions, and we will share the deck and I think maybe even a recording of this. And so if you want to copy and paste those questions into an email to your data providers, I know how I would answer those in response, but feel free to take those and use those with other partners after this meeting. With that, I think that we may have 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A. Thanks very much for joining. Here's my contact information, as well as ways to reach anyone at Foursquare, or get in touch with others on our team. Ariana, I'll hand it back to you for some questions.
Great. And thank you so much, Tyler. That was really wonderful. We did have a couple questions come in. I think the first thing that we would just love to touch on is just the relevance or importance of location as a signal right now. So we've talked about how our scale isn't declining, but why should we care about location specifically as a signal as all of these changes are taking place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I've been tracking, right, like the scale and health of our panels very closely, and how these sorts of platform changes have been affecting them. I think we talked about how our scale is healthy today. I would not say that, just healthy scale means that we are static, or that we are slowing down the sort of development and preparation for future solutions. I also think, just as someone in this industry, right, like location as a signal is pretty important as the world starts to come back, as we enter what's going to be, I expect, a very unique Q4 holiday season, right? If I think about my own behavior over the course of the past 18 months, and the places that I was going in June of 2020 as opposed to June of 2021, pre and post vaccination, right? Many of us are planning to spend more time outside of our homes. I'm traveling more, right? My patterns of visitation have totally changed. This is like an inflection point in time. And so, location is the signal that helps you understand those consumer behavior trends, and ultimately helps you, I think, reach consumers at this moment in time when their behavior is changing.
Yeah, absolutely. We had another question come in about iOS 15 specifically, and just, is there any impact that release in particular has on any of the solutions that you talked about in the presentation today?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. So there are really kind of like two components to iOS 15. One is for users who are using Apple's iCloud Plus service, and getting their email through that. There's a sort of blocking of email trackers that's occurring. I don't think that does not affect Foursquare's business today. I do think it's interesting from the perspective of a trend in which we've seen sort of a lot of marketers begin to retrench to more and more email marketing. And so I think that it demonstrates that strategy may not last over the long run. Although, having a first party relationship and connection with a consumer is important. So the sort of impetus behind more and more email marketing makes sense in building up that CRM database. That part doesn't affect us. The other piece is that there's now the ability as a user to go into like the settings on your iPhone and begin blocking IP address sharing with marketers in Safari. And this really builds on the third-party cookie blocking, right, ad tracker blocking that's in intelligent tracking prevention, and has been for a number of years, as we saw on that timeline slide. In some small ways that may affect Foursquare's ability to collect exposure data via the Pixel, but Safari has been a place for a long period of time because of third-party cookie blocking, where just sort of, right, like measurement has been a challenge. And so I really see this as, one, a change that affects Foursquare in a very small and minimal way, but more broadly as a recognition that collecting and leveraging identifiers that are not authenticated or not, right, collected with very affirmative consent for use across the advertising ecosystem is not something that is a long-term strategy. And so, even though Foursquare, let's say per se, isn't affected meaningfully by iOS 15, I think that iOS 15 is, sort of another indication that moving towards first-party data collection, towards authenticated relationships with users or logged-in experiences for consumers, solutions that are then built on top of that, those data sets, that's really where the future lies.
Definitely. And I think we'll just have time for one more. Would love to just hear your perspective, Tyler, on what's coming next in policy, and maybe even more specifically with regards to competition policy.
Yeah. Foursquare has been an advocate for many years for federal privacy legislation. We actually just recently, our general counsel recently published an op-ed a month or two ago in a DC publication calling again for a comprehensive federal privacy law. We ultimately believe that the sort of patchwork of state laws that is emerging with California, with Virginia, with Colorado, right, is going to create confusion for consumers and is going to create barriers to entry and ultimately sort of stifle business dynamism and innovation, not just in the advertising ecosystem, but sort of more broadly across digital content and services. And so a comprehensive federal privacy law is, we think, the sort of solution that will ultimately, create trust in the internet again among consumers, that will benefit consumers and companies alike. Competition is interesting because you see at the same time as a sort of focus on privacy, an uptick in a focus on large digital platforms and their market share. And I think we also believe that a federal privacy law should be combined with, really sort of robust competition oversight and enforcement, that sort of, oversight will ultimately accrue to the benefit of small and medium-sized businesses. And that at the same time that you are creating sort of necessary regulatory hurdles, or necessary legal hurdles for businesses to operate, because we need to protect consumer privacy, you don't want to allow that new set of regulations or obligations to make it so that way, or to become another moat for large technology companies to ultimately entrench themselves. We think that privacy and competition are not at odds, and that both of those things can be possible, and that will be realized when we have both a comprehensive federal privacy bill and we have, whether it's via legislative action, FTC enforcement, and enforcement by even EU regulators and others, real competition oversight as well.
Thank you so much, Tyler, for all of your insight and for walking us through the presentation today. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. We'll be following up with an email with a recording of this presentation so that you can pull out all those questions that you might want to ask your data partners and start implementing all of these strategies. So thank you so much again for your time, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, Ariana.
Thank you.